Hi again, everyone. Welcome to ACC Breakdown. We come your way every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern Time with the very best bloggers in the ACC. And tonight that means Brittnee Taylor Newman. It also means Dan Rubin of BC Interruption to go through our little exercise that we've had so much fun with over the past couple of weeks. And this is kind of my way of solving the issue that I have with not enough big-time non-conference games, because that bothers me each and every football season, and I just rant about it all year. So this is a way to vent in a healthy and productive way. So we've got Brittnee, we've got Dan, we've got myself, and we are matching up the ACC this week against the Big Ten, top to bottom. So I love this because we've got all 14 teams in each conference involved. We didn't have to take 2 or 4 teams out like we did with the Big 12 and the Pac-12. So we've got everybody in play, and this is extremely scientific because, of course, we would correctly predict these games each and every time. So I'm interested to see how this shakes out because considering, now I think this very much, Dan and Brittnee, attests to your professionalism and your cohort's professionalism in that we've matched up the ACC and the SEC and also against the Pac-12, and the ACC lost to the SEC 42-14 and lost to the Pac-12 30-18. So you guys are true professionals and unbiased. So Brittnee, we will start with you. We've got a little matchup between a couple college football playoff teams that were playing in different time slots, didn't play one another. Clemson, of course, got the job done against Oklahoma. Michigan State fell about that well shy of winning against Alabama 38-0. So we'll start at the very top of the Big Ten and the ACC with the 1 seeds. Maybe not necessarily the best team in the Big Ten, but they won the conference. Brittnee, we've got Clemson and we've got Michigan State.
Yes, also the battle that I like to refer to as the dab versus the windmill move. You know, we've got a couple other competitions there, the dance moves. But for me, you know, this comes down to looking at the easy common denominator, as you already alluded to, Alabama. Michigan State lost to Alabama 38-0. It was quite a walloping there, whereas Clemson, on the other hand, was able to keep it much closer. They were competing all the way through the game and tied 24-24 in the fourth quarter before that onside kick that began to change everything. So for me, just looking at how Clemson was able to hang in with the Crimson Tide there towards the end, whereas Michigan State wasn't, kind of said something about how they're able to hold up there in the spotlight in those big games. So, the metaphor world where we're looking at these teams possibly playing each other in the postseason, I think that kind of says something there about the Clemson Tigers. So for me, I think that's enough for me to take the Tigers in this matchup.
All right, Dan, we've got hard-charging Michigan State, known for the running game, the front seven on defense, and a Clemson team that is pretty much as athletic as any football team in the country, the way Dabo Swinney has built this program in recent years. The Tigers and Sparty.
Yeah, and I'm going to agree just because I didn't think Michigan State was as good as maybe the 4 seed, or as maybe their seeding and getting them into the playoff actually had them. I say the 4 seed, but they were actually, I think went into the playoff as the number 3 team, not the number 4, or else they would have played Clemson in the semifinal anyway. I made it vocal that even going into the Big Ten championship, I thought that Iowa was a better team. I was then proven wrong when Michigan State won, but it was a close game. One thing that I didn't like about Michigan State watching this year is that there were too many games that I felt that they won that they barely won. I know that they only beat Rutgers by a touchdown. They only beat a bad Purdue team by a field goal, and they needed a mental goof and a half by Michigan to win that game. So I picked Clemson in this game mostly because Clemson throughout the year, top to bottom, was a stalwart. They were the best team in college football up until they lost to Alabama. And not only do I think that they're going to beat them, I don't necessarily think it's going to be as close of a result as Michigan State maybe had against Alabama. No, I'm just kidding. It's not going to get worse than 38-0. But I don't think Clemson's winning that game.
Yeah, Mark D'Antonio's done an amazing job at Michigan State. You could say the same for Dabo Swinney. This is a couple of programs that we're used to seeing win 7, 8 games, but in recent years have risen to the elite of college football. Michigan State has won some of the biggest bowl games in the last 4 or 5 years, Rose Bowls, Cotton Bowls, beaten just about everybody across the board, the TCUs, the Baylors, the Georgias, the Stanfords in big bowl games. But this past year, even though they rose to the top of the Big Ten, as you allude to, Dan, not really the strong performance across the board week in, week out. They found ways to win. Ohio State had that inexplicable performance in Columbus when 2/3 of that team's going to be playing in the NFL next year. Couldn't beat a Michigan State team that was rather limited. Credit them for getting to the college football playoff, but Connor Cook, immobile in the pocket, not a great running game that you would expect Michigan State to have. Clemson, too much speed, too much athleticism. I do think Michigan State, because of the fundamentals and regardless of what we saw against Alabama, would make it a really good game, but Clemson just too talented for Michigan State. So we got a clean sweep there with the Tigers over Michigan State. Okay, we drop down to the 2 seeds, and we've talked about this in recent weeks with North Carolina. Maybe not the second best team in the ACC, taking on maybe not the second best team in the Big Ten. But Dan, to your point, Iowa came like that close from beating Michigan State. Michigan State scored with 15, 20 seconds left in the game, barely got the ball across the plane to upset or to beat Iowa. I shouldn't say it was an upset in the Big Ten championship game. So we got a couple of overachievers here, Brittnee, this past season in North Carolina and Iowa.
Yeah, and this is a game, I was thinking about this leading up to this week. This is a game I actually really would love to see. Last year's UNC team versus last year's Iowa team. There's kind of 2 things that I looked at here. They had a couple of mutual opponents. Both played Illinois. Iowa beat Illinois 29-20. UNC beat them 48-14. Both teams played Pitt. Iowa beat Pitt 27-24, so small 3-point win there. UNC beat them 26-19, so at least by a touchdown. I mean, I think when you look at the numbers too, offensively of what they were able to produce, the numbers kind of back up that slight scoring edge that you saw there. UNC had 3,142 rushing yards to Iowa's 2,544. They had 3,675 receiving yards to Iowa's 2,862. So there's a little bit of a higher production level there, I think. And Marquise Williams, I still think the world of. So in this one, I'm giving a little bit of an edge to UNC.
All right, Dan. Brittnee has stepped up the bar here. She's bringing the homework. We are outclassed in this one.
We are. It's gonna be great when I start giving picks based off of how I feel, and this guy's logo is bad, and I don't like this coach, so I'm not picking him. I can't wait for those picks once we get in a couple of picks down and a number of different areas where I just decide to just throw caution to the wind.
We are shattering all sorts of gender stereotypes tonight. Very well done, Dan.
Hey, my wife won a March Madness bracket pool by picking states she'd been in, logos of the school, and cute centers, and somehow managed to massacre me in a pool one year. So maybe she was onto something.
If you're matching up cute centers in this game, Dan, I may not have a problem on the show. North Carolina and Iowa. What you got?
I'm gonna take Iowa, and I'm gonna take Iowa for one reason, and that's 18.5 points allowed per game. 15th best in the nation. I feel that North Carolina can put up a lot of points, and I think that their defense was vastly improved this year more so than last year. I don't think anybody would dispute that. But Iowa won games by shutting down opponents, and I know that smash mouth football is the hallmark of the Big Ten, and I think as we saw in the national championship game with an Alabama-type team, which Alabama is a pro-style offense. They did throw the ball, I felt, a lot better than they did in past years. But Kirk Ferentz is the type of guy who runs a multiple set pro-style offense, control the clock, and then let his defense go to work against North Carolina. I think that defense was good enough to shut down an offense as good as the Tar Heels, and they'll win that based off of that.
I understand Brittnee's analysis there. It's easy to look at the stat sheet to compare the scores. Nicely done right there, Brittnee. And if you really look at the Iowa-Pitt game, Iowa needed to kick like a 57-yard field goal at the gun to win that game at home against Pitt. So Iowa won those ugly games. They won with defense. They finally got ripped apart by Christian McCaffrey and company in the Rose Bowl. But, yeah, it's easy to look at the stat sheet and the offensive playmakers and production and look at North Carolina and what they achieved last year. But I love Iowa running the football. I love the defensive front seven. Desmond King at corner, maybe the best covered corner in the country with like 8 or 9 interceptions. I think Iowa would grind it out and win the game. They held Wisconsin to 6 points. They beat a lot of good teams like Northwestern, took Michigan State to the 1-yard line as well. I like Iowa in a interesting contrast of styles against the Tar Heels in that one. Okay, we drop down to the 3 seed, and this is really the marquee matchup in terms of name brands for these two conferences. When we go Florida State and Ohio State, the Buckeyes narrowly missed the college football playoff. Then they really whipped up on Michigan and Notre Dame to conclude the season. Florida State down year for them at 10-2. Then they really didn't show up in the bowl game, Brittnee, against Houston. You got the Noles and the Buckeyes, and most seasons this would be a serious matchup.
Yeah, this is another one that I think that I would absolutely love to see. It was interesting kind of looking at some of the numbers from the season. Both of these teams obviously had questions at quarterback this year. There was some movement there. What I think was interesting for Florida State was that Dalvin Cook really ended up kind of being a centerpiece of their offensive attack. But when you looked at their 3 losses and even at some other close calls that they had, those teams were able to stifle him in situations where perhaps you would expect that they wouldn't be able to. You even saw a little bit of that in the FSU-Boston College game, some of that at Georgia Tech. So that obviously becomes a little bit tricky when your offense is being carried not by a quarterback like Jameis Winston, but by someone like Dalvin Cook, and you're sort of hanging on by the quarterback, by the strings there. So when you look at Ohio State, they ended the year with the 7th-ranked defense in the nation. Obviously, when you're looking at some of the teams that they played, perhaps that helps a few of their stats there, but I think Ohio State ultimately would have been able to quiet Dalvin Cook, and depending on what point of the season they played, you're not even sure which quarterback would be in, which then changes that equation entirely for me, because there were a couple of different teams on the field in Garnet jerseys this year, depending on what point of the season you're at and which quarterback was on the field. So for me, I kind of think that Ohio State would be able to squeak away with this one. Perhaps not even squeak away, perhaps win it fairly solidly, but I'm taking the Buckeyes in this one.
Right, Dan. Athletes all over the place in this one. You can pick the year. It doesn't matter. And even though this was not a vintage Florida State squad, still crazy athleticism, Jalen Ramsey and company on defense. But Ohio State, they are most likely going to set records in the NFL draft this year with picks, high picks, crazy talent for these two teams.
Yeah, and the thing that makes the game more scary when you pair up Florida State, Ohio State, is the fact that the number of guys that would have played in this game if they played each other probably will make a Pro Bowl or a Super Bowl, is that point, which is that the NFL draft would have been the NFL scouts would have been salivating over these two teams. I love talking about defenses. I love defenses in general, unless you get a really otherworldly offense that has shredded every defense on the planet. Florida State's defense was really good this year. They only allowed 16 points per game. They were one of the best defenses in the nation. They were a tough team to score against. They were based off of the stats. But take into consideration that they played half of their games against really bad football teams. They're holding teams like Boston College scoreless. They're holding teams like Florida to 2 points. They're playing teams that, in short, weren't on their level. And then you look within their own conference, they're playing teams like Syracuse. They got Georgia Tech on a down year. They're at Wake Forest, teams that weren't really that good, as opposed to Ohio State, who had the 2nd best defense in the nation, and they played in a conference that you got to go through a lot of teams that arguably are better than some of the teams that Florida State had to play. Plus, Ohio State, in terms of, like I said, Big Ten, smash-mouth style football, they went in that bowl game and they lit up Notre Dame to a point that I could not stop cackling to myself watching it. I loved every second of that. So I'm taking the Buckeyes because, quite honestly, Ohio State, if they had had a crack at the top 4, may have found themselves in the national title game. They might have upset Clemson in that first game. But they would have been a great team to watch in that Final Four. But instead, I'll take the win over Notre Dame, and then I'll take a win over Florida State here too.
To Brittnee's point, off the top there, Cardell Jones was named the starter. Urban Meyer, guy knows what he's doing. He is like 52-4, 52-5 at Ohio State. It's crazy what the winning percentage is. But I don't think Cardell Jones was the right pick, and that proved itself out after 10 or 11 games. They inserted J.T. Barrett, took him a couple weeks to get in the groove, and then, wow, they took off. And, yeah, those last two games against Michigan and Notre Dame, we're talking about two teams that finished in the top 10. Ohio State killed them. They will have, most likely, an NFL corner selected in the first round, Eli Apple, safety Von Bell, first rounder, Joey Bosa, top 5 pick, and a linebacker in Darren Lee who ran a sub 4.4 at linebacker who will make his way into the first round. They are just oozing with talent going back to 2015's team, and probably the first running back off the board in the NFL draft in Ezekiel Elliott, and possibly the first wide receiver in Michael Thomas, probably a second or third guy. They had 3 receivers enter the NFL draft this year. I just think they're a little too much for Florida State. That Florida State defense is serious, but they had so much trouble finding offense and finding big play offense that Dalvin Cook bailed them out so much. I think Ohio State wins solidly. Very entertaining game, but a solid 7 or 10 point win. Okay, we drop down to the 4 seeds. I think Pitt accomplished so much this year in going 6-2 in the ACC. There could be an argument that the 4 or 5 teams below them are more talented. Not a dynamic team, very workmanlike team, Brittnee. Taking on a Michigan team that, if you look at the losses, Dan alluded to one, they just blew the game against Michigan State. That was one of the craziest finishes ever in college football. Lost to Ohio State, lost to a really good Utah team in the opener when I don't think Michigan was quite in sync and ready to roll. But once they got rolling, boy, they played really good football. Beat Florida by 34 in a bowl game. Pitt and Michigan, who we got lined up here at the 4 spots, Brittnee.
Yeah, well, I think this one is interesting, and like you said, the loss to Ohio State, I believe, was understandable for them, but those other 2 losses, they very easily could have beat Michigan State. And at the beginning of the season, you're right, it didn't seem like they were quite in sync. I think they perhaps were a little better than maybe we thought they were with all those losses on their record. But what was interesting to me when looking at their schedule for the year, Pitt only played 2 ranked teams, number 5 Notre Dame and a number 21 Navy postseason. They lost to both teams by more than a touchdown. When you're looking at Michigan, they beat number 22 BYU, number 13 Northwestern, and number 19 Florida there at the end. The only ranked losses that they had were the top 10 teams, a number 7 Michigan State and a number 8 Ohio State. So when you're just looking at like the quality of wins and losses there, I think that you kind of find Michigan sandwiched somewhere right in between those lower tier, top 25 teams that they were beating and perhaps below those top 10 teams that they lost to. And I'm not sure, for all their accomplishments in the ACC this year, that you can say the same for Pitt. They've definitely come up so much further. Narduzzi's done a great job, like you said, but I don't know that we'd rank them there. So for me, this one comes out to be a Michigan win.
And if I'm not mistaken, they killed Northwestern and BYU and Florida. They shut out BYU and Northwestern, and then they beat Florida 41-7. These were not football games. Dan, what do you think about Pitt taking on Michigan? Neutral site.
I'm probably going with Michigan, and that kills me to say it because, number one, we're referring to them incorrectly. Their team name isn't Michigan. It's the team up north. We have to refer to them by their appropriate name. And number two, God, I hate Jim Harbaugh with an utter passion that dates back to my New England Patriots fandom. So the fact that I'm picking the team up north is a miracle. But here's the fact. I mean, it doesn't matter which Pitt Panther team we're talking about. If we're talking about, Kadri Ollison and Nathan Peterman, or the team that we thought we were going to get out of them, which was James Conner and Chad Voidick. I know I've talked about that a couple times, which is the team that ended from Pitt was not the team that I thought they'd have at the beginning of the year. I really liked Pitt at the beginning of the year. It turns out that they finished 4th in the league, but and I chalk away the bowl loss, which was I don't think they expected to be playing in that game, and they ran into a hot Navy team that was really happy and really pumped to be playing in that game. Pitt kind of slogged their feet, I feel, based off their fan response, after they were named into that bowl game. And I don't think they were really up for what was a very competitive military bowl. So I think they got blown out because it was a desire thing at that point. But Michigan's just a better team overall. I mean, they're a much better team no matter which Pittsburgh team we're talking about, beginning of the year or end of the year. So like you alluded to with the scores, it's gonna be Michigan.
I don't think Michigan would completely demolish Pitt, but I think they would win comfortably. I think BYU, Northwestern, I think Northwestern's better than Pitt, but they're comparable, very comparable teams. Northwestern, BYU, and Penn State, and Michigan handled those teams 30-0, 41-7 against Florida, 31-7. You know, they beat up those teams that are comparable to Pitt. I think Wolverines win it. All right, we drop down to a number 5 game. That's a pretty interesting game here. Northwestern had a really nice season, overachieved at 10-2. They kind of showed that maybe athletically they couldn't keep up with an SEC team against Tennessee. Got blown out in the bowl game, finished 10-3. Louisville, rough start, tough schedule. Auburn and Clemson early, 0-3. Really found their legs after that and put together a pretty nice season. Beat Texas A&M in the Music City Bowl. So we got Louisville, Lamar Jackson running the controls against the Northwestern team that really brings the lunch pails. When you talk about a workmanlike team, Brittnee, you're talking about the Wildcats.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, finished 10-3, but all 3 of those losses were to ranked teams. What I think is interesting about Louisville is the Cardinals hung in with Auburn at the beginning of the season, a number 6 ranked Auburn team. Perhaps they were a little more highly ranked than they should have been coming into the season, but it's not for us to judge at this point. But they were able to lose only by 7 points. They lost 34-31 to the same Houston team that ended up beating Florida State in the bowl game at the end of the season, and lost by only 3 points to a Clemson team. So although they kind of had a rough season, they definitely had questions at quarterback. We talked about that a couple of times on the show already. I kind of like the idea of Louisville maybe being able to beat Northwestern, just because I've seen them hang in with some teams that we probably thought they wouldn't have been able to hang in with. So it's an interesting matchup for sure, but I give the edge to Louisville in this one.
Yeah, this is a type of game we don't typically get to see. We're seeing kind of that second tier in both conferences, and they're very different football teams. And I think much like the Iowa-North Carolina game on the surface, it's easy to side with Louisville, just a little bit more dynamic of a team. But Northwestern wins 10 games for some reason. They figure it out. Dan, who do you like in this one?
I don't like Northwestern, and this is why. Northwestern really struggled to score points throughout the year. They finished well over 100th in terms of scoring offense. They weren't the worst offense in the nation, but they weren't very good either. I think they only averaged 20 points per game, and that Louisville defense was good. I mean, don't let anyone kid you. That Louisville defense could wreak havoc on backfields. They could get in on quarterbacks, and they could do damage when they absolutely needed to. Plus, Louisville's offense, despite rolling out 3 quarterbacks at any point during the season, Lamar Jackson, Kyle Bolin, Reggie Bonifant, it didn't matter who it was. They still averaged a good amount of passing offense. They still managed to be a top 50 offense, and they still managed to put some points up. And even though they had some trouble running the ball during the year, the fact that their best running back was their quarterback and Lamar Jackson, I think that type of element is just enough where if the game's close, you put the ball in the quarterback's hands or you put the ball in the offense's hands. Louisville's offense was better than Northwestern's, and they'll be able to get those last points. So I think this is a really close matchup, but I think Louisville would win.
I would love to watch this game. I think Louisville is a more talented team. I think Northwestern would find a way to win. They lost to Michigan and Iowa, 2 teams in the top 10. Those were the 2 regular season losses. Yes, they got blindsided by Tennessee, but I think Tennessee is actually a top 10 talented team. And they beat Duke and they beat Stanford. Louisville didn't come up with wins like that. I just think Northwestern would figure out a way. I know that they were extremely compromised offensively trying to produce points on the outside, but Justin Jackson, running back, 1,300 yards, one of the best in the Big Ten. All right, let's drop it down to a really intriguing game where we've got Miami taking on Wisconsin, a couple teams that had sorted seasons. Wisconsin really lost to the upper echelon of the Big Ten. They lost to Iowa 10-6. They lost to Alabama. They lost to Northwestern inexplicably, but they beat USC in a bowl game, a very talented team. Miami, with all the turmoil, still finished well and went 8-5 after losing to Washington State in a bowl game. Brittnee.
Yeah, I think this one is interesting, like you said. I've probably said that about every single matchup, but it's so interesting when you've got these two conferences that don't actually play each other to think about how these would turn out. The common denominator here, both teams played Nebraska. Miami won 36-33. Wisconsin won 23-21. So you're not really able to glean very much from that at all. What I thought was interesting about Miami, and this was something that I predicted against all season long, and they proved me wrong. But when you looked at the second half of the season, they had a fairly close loss to Florida State and then two very predictable losses to UNC and to Clemson. So for whatever reason, despite all of the turmoil, Brad Kaya and the receivers were always able to pull it out. And for the second half of the season, the only losses they had were those that we would expect to really, really good teams in the ACC, the few teams that were actually kind of top tier in the conference. So for me, I kind of got a little caught up in the intrigue of that, the fact that this team we all expected to fall apart somehow managed to keep producing, definitely led by their quarterback. You really saw a lot of Kaya's leadership come out there towards the end as he was sort of keeping everything together for them. So to me, I like that edge, and I would take I would take Miami in this one. Perhaps not by very much, but maybe just by just a touchdown, but the Hurricanes.
Okay, Dan, Miami finished 8-5. It could have been much worse. They lost to Clemson 58-0. Al Golden fired. The wheels didn't come off as we all expected. They beat some decent teams, as Brittnee alluded to, down the stretch before falling to a really good Washington State team by a touchdown in the bowl game. Wisconsin finished up strong against USC, 10-3 after beating the Trojans in the Holiday Bowl.
And one of the things that I think we left out when we're talking about Miami beating Nebraska is that it happened before Miami figured it out. Miami was 3-0, which I'd have expected them to have been 2-1 at that point if they hadn't beaten Nebraska, and then maybe Al Golden doesn't even make it to the Clemson game after they lose to Cincinnati and Florida State. They beat Nebraska with Al Golden as their coach, and with the turmoil of people flying banners over the Orange Bowl or Sun Life Stadium or Dolphin Stadium or any number of names that you want to say what it is right down in South Florida, saying please fire Al Golden, while Florida State was selling shirts saying keep Al Golden. So all of that happens, and Wisconsin is always level. I mean, Wisconsin's always going to be that team that when they're really good, they have an elite running back, they're able to pound the ball, use defense, get it done, and play Big Ten football. Miami crested at the end, like you said, with the predictable losses, but really got it on track, and then played in a Sun Bowl that was not sunny at all, as opposed to the Holiday Bowl where Wisconsin went out and did a very good job. But I think when you have Brad Kaya, you have the team figuring it out. They're better offensively than Joel Stave, who made some bad decisions throwing the football at times this year. I think Miami wins it. And I think Miami wins it even if you use the team maybe at the beginning of the year. I'm just saying, I don't necessarily think they'd have lost that game with Al Golden as their head coach either.
All right, Wisconsin, actually what separated this Wisconsin team from past Wisconsin teams that were better is that they didn't have the ground game that they had in the past. They actually started 4 freshman offensive linemen and lost some guys to the NFL into graduation. They didn't have the big back because Corey Clement was supposed to be that guy. He had 1,000 yards. Get this, 1,000 yards the year before as the backup to Melvin Gordon, who had 2,500 yards rushing. That's how stacked they are at running back. Had 3,000-yard rushers a few years ago with James White, Monte Ball in the mix. So that's how they love to run the ball, as you mentioned, Dan. So Joel Stave, not the kind of quarterback who's going to carry a team. They got Corey Clement back for the bowl game for like the last 2 games and the bowl game against USC. Wisconsin, as you well know, in tracking the best defenses in the country, Dan, may have wrestled one of those 2 or 3 titles away from your BC Eagles late in the season for top rushing defense, scoring defense. They're all right there in the top 3 or 4. I think Wisconsin's got a great defense. I think they win this game over Miami. I just think they're a much more consistent team and get the job done against I would be intrigued to watch this game, but I take the Badgers in this one. Then we got Virginia Tech taking on Penn State, a couple teams that finished 7-6. Virginia Tech got a light touch in the bowl game against Tulsa and survived, gave up 52 points to Tulsa somehow. Penn State had to play Georgia without Christian Hackenberg, their NFL soon-to-be quarterback. So, Brittnee, who do you like with the Hokies and the Nittany Lions?
Well, I think if you're looking at what Nebraska was able to do, Nebraska played Miami this year, as we were just kind of talking about, had great numbers against Miami. They were able to put up 33 points. They kept Miami from converting any fourth downs during that game and still won despite 3 turnovers. So if I'm looking at Nebraska in this game, especially if I know we said neutral site, but especially if it's at home, I think that kind of gives Nebraska an edge. I like the Cornhuskers. I like the way they play football, so I'm taking the Cornhuskers in this one.
Sorry, we got Penn State and Virginia Tech. Did I screw that up?
Yes.
Oh, did I screw that up on the list?
No, I think just maybe they're announcing it. I'm not sure. I think we had them.
Penn State finished ahead of Nebraska, so it would be Penn State. So I'm sorry for throwing anybody off here.
That's all right. We got notes on those games too. We can roll with whatever you want to throw at us.
All right. Penn State and Virginia Tech.
All right, Penn State, Virginia Tech?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so Penn State, when you're looking at their losses, they lost to Temple, they lost to Georgia, they lost to Northwestern. When you're looking at their offensive numbers, I don't know. I hate the ACC fans are going to hate me this week, but I think I would have to take Penn State in that.
They're not going to hate you as much as they're hating me at this point, but keep going. All right, so we got Penn State in win column there. Dan, who do you like, the Hokies and the Nittany Lions, couple 7-6 teams?
You know, I looked at Penn State when I was looking down their schedule, and a couple of things jumped out at me. Number one is that they did lose to Temple, and I know that Temple was a very good team this year. I know that Temple was Pennsylvania's college football team this year. I mean, they were the prohibitive, with the exception, though Pitt might say something different. They were the darling of the Keystone State. So I think that the Temple was a good team, but still, if you're Penn State, Christian Hackenberg's your quarterback. You've got a good enough offense that maybe you shouldn't lose that game, and yet they did. And at the same time, Virginia Tech went out and lost to East Carolina to officially give them the thorn in the side, because I don't think Virginia Tech knows how to beat East Carolina at this point. But I looked at these two teams and I saw similar results. They lost games that they should have won. They maybe won games that were closer than they should have been. I know Penn State, I think, beat Army by less than a touchdown, and I know that Virginia Tech barely beat Georgia Tech. So, if you're looking for a marquee win and a marquee loss, or a marquee barely won, they both have them. That's what makes this game compelling. So the big difference is in terms of interceptions and in terms of quarterback play. Quarterback play for Penn State, they didn't throw that many interceptions. They only threw 6 the whole year, and Christian Hackenberg was a better quarterback than the majority of people in the FBS in terms of natural talent and ability. Virginia Tech lost Michael Brewer. Brendan Motley came in. He did a very good job. He played well enough for them, and by very good, he wasn't Michael Brewer. Brewer came back and was Michael Brewer, and they still threw 14 interceptions between the two of them. I think Virginia Tech is a flawed football team because of that. Penn State, they're not. I don't think necessarily they're a great football team, but they'd find a way to win this because Virginia Tech is a very flawed football team in terms of decision making. Maybe even in terms of behind the bench. James Franklin might be a better coach, is a better coach than Frank Beamer in 2015.
Dan, if you were selling me Penn State is a great football team at 7-6, then again, you're bordering on.
They're good. They're a good
elimination here.
They're a good football team, not a great football team. They're better in what I'm used to.
I think this would be an extremely close game. I like Dan's points about Penn State. Christian Hackenberg will probably squeeze into the first round of the NFL draft. He's that good. The reason Penn State lost 6 games is because they play in a meat grinder of a division against Ohio State, Michigan, and Michigan State. So, bam, 3 losses against elite teams, top 10 teams. Virginia Tech, this is almost the dividing line. Penn State, Nebraska, Indiana, Virginia Tech, Duke, NC State. They're the teams that beat all the bad teams and lose to all the good teams. and Penn State had to play really good teams at the top of the level. Virginia Tech, not so much. They missed Florida State and Clemson in the other division. They play in the lesser division. Good teams, not great teams in the Atlantic. So Penn State in a close one over Virginia Tech. If you follow Penn State football, excellent defense. Big-time running back as a freshman. He ran all over Ohio State for 200 yards. Hackenberg at quarterback. They had no offensive line. Horrible offensive line. So if Virginia Tech wins that game, it's because they have a defensive line and 2 corners, and maybe they could have made life really tough on Christian Hackenberg. But I like Penn State in a close one here. All right, we dive down to the 8 game with Nebraska and Duke. Duke won its first bowl game in forever, 1961, with a close one over Indiana that was just missed in a rematch here by 1 seeding, taking on Nebraska. Nebraska went 5-7, lost excruciating games like nobody in the country, and then they beat UCLA in a bowl game. So probably the best 6 and 7 team you're going to come across, Brittnee.
Yeah, I think so. I definitely, as I kind of alluded to earlier, when looking at their numbers against Miami and how they were able to perform there, I think this one is one where I would take Nebraska.
Okay. Dan, what do you like in this one? Duke's got the better record. Nebraska, again, if you look into these games that they lost, Hail Mary against BYU, just ridiculous play against Wisconsin, and on, overtime against Miami on like a deflected pass. They had all sorts of crazy things happen against them, but then at the end of the year, they get to go to a bowl game, and they beat a good UCLA team in a bowl game.
And if they had lost that bowl game, I guess I'd have more of an argument that said they didn't belong there. And I still believe they didn't belong in that bowl game. They didn't win half their games, and they needed a loophole to get in there. So I'm going to go ahead and say, and even though they won that bowl game, I don't think they belonged in there, and that's part of why I'm going to pick Duke. Yeah, they won that game, and I think that's great that they won one game against one team that was a pretty good UCLA team. But I don't necessarily think Nebraska was worthy of that type of consideration. Duke, on the other hand, was a team that I really liked during the year. I didn't even try to fake it that I didn't like him. I thought Thomas Sirk was not the best quarterback that we saw in the ACC, but he showed flashes. He showed that he could command an offense when he was handed the reins. Threw for 2,600 yards, threw for 16 touchdowns, and he was able to run. I think he was their leading rusher. I think he had 900 yards, 800 yards maybe. But the thing that I really like about Duke is coaching. I love David Cutcliffe. If I could hire a coach in the ACC to rebuild my beloved Boston College Eagles, he might be the guy that I would want to pick in the ACC to do it, if, of course, Steve Addazio can't figure it out. I love that he is the coach of Duke. I think he's the right guy at the right time. I think he knows how to command his team. I think his team really knows how to play for him. And if you take away that one really bad loss to Virginia, they lost to some good football teams, and I think Duke goes into this game and wins it.
I'm sure that Brittnee came across this in her score analysis. Nebraska beat one other decent team. Right up there.
Yeah, but
knock off Michigan State. That's not too shabby.
Even a blind squirrel finds a nut sometime.
So they beat Michigan State. The score comparison here, Duke lost to Northwestern, touchdown, 10-point game. Nebraska lost another one of those excruciating, like, Hail Mary, 50-yard field goal deals to Northwestern. Okay, all that said, I'm defending Nebraska. I think Duke would win the game. These last 4 have been very difficult for me to pick. I like Duke. They found ways to win. Strong defense, running game. They get the job done against the Nebraska team that was error-prone, and Tommy Armstrong threw like 18 interceptions last year. Ouch. All right, we drop down, and before we get to this matchup, it's kind of our dividing line, good teams, bad teams. We'll keep in mind that last year they played 7 games, the ACC and the Big Ten. The Big Ten won 4, the ACC 3. A lot of close matchups here. The Big Ten, 4 wins, Indiana over Wake, Northwestern over Duke, Iowa over the aforementioned Pitt game we talked about. Ohio State beat Virginia Tech on opening night. Duke lost to or beat Indiana in overtime, Miami in overtime over Nebraska. North Carolina killed Illinois. There you got it, 4-3, Big Ten over the ACC this past year. Now we dip down to North Carolina State and Indiana, a couple 9 seeds, Brittnee.
Yeah, well, when you're looking at these two teams, schedule-wise, both teams beat Wake. NC State is one of those teams. If you play in the ACC, they're always a little tricky. Sometimes they manage to come in and upset you when you're least expecting it. Florida State fans will certainly tell you that. But one thing that I really liked about Indiana is their quarterback, Nate Sudfeld, threw for 3,573 yards this season with a receiving core that had a total of 3,820 yards for the season. As much as I liked Jacoby Brissett, he averaged more around 2,600 yards for the season, I believe. So if we're looking at it by the numbers there, I think that Indiana might have a little bit of edge when it comes to their receiving core and quarterback play. So I took Indiana in this one.
All right, Dan, you got NC State. They finished up at 8-5, I believe. They got trounced by Mississippi State. Indiana, the Pinstripe Bowl against Duke, entertaining game. They went to overtime, 10 of points scored, and they missed on that field goal that went over the upright that was ruled no good. So that's our matchup right there.
And I'm going to make it really easy by pointing out one stat. NC State under Dave Doran has beaten one Power 5 conference team with a winning record. They go to bowl games because they beat up on the little boys. They're a bully, essentially. They're a big team who beats up on the little guys. Indiana might have fallen apart through the course of the year, but at least they have that win over Wake Forest, and then they rallied to beat Maryland and Purdue to get into the bowl game. They could have easily fallen apart and not gotten into a bowl game, and then they went into the bowl game and nearly knocked off Duke. And you know what? I can't think of any other situation where a team would want to have a kicker cost them the Pinstripe Bowl. I mean, that is something that at least it wasn't an extra point, right? It was a missed field goal, not an extra point. But I'm taking Indiana.
All right, Indiana for Dan, Indiana for me. This is the reason why. Indiana had the ball at the 4-yard line to beat Ohio State. They took Michigan to overtime. They played well against Michigan State until about 10 minutes left. They played well against really good teams. NC State, Dan, you played it out perfectly. They beat up on 4 bad teams. This is the formula. Then they go 3-5 in the ACC, and they wind up in a bowl game. Then they play another good team, and they get trounced. And that's what happened against Mississippi State. Brittnee, who'd you take in this one? I forgot to write you down.
Indiana.
Indiana, wow. 3-game sweep for the Hoosiers, surprisingly. All right, it's getting a little ugly now. We got Virginia taking on Minnesota, Brittnee.
Yeah, this is one of those ones, it gets harder when you get down there at the bottom. As Dan was joking about earlier, this is one of those ones that I think I picked by gut instinct, or maybe just hopefulness that this is the one game that the Cavaliers could win this season. They definitely had a tough season, and I think we talked about this at the beginning of the year on the show. They played some really, really good teams. They had a really, really intense start to their season, but breaking it down by the numbers, I don't feel like I get any clear direction on who would win. So I'm just going to root for the Cavs that this could be the token win at the end of their season.
Yeah, and that wouldn't be a shocker. I think they beat a couple decent teams in the ACC. They did go 3-5. If they played the North Carolina State non-conference schedule, they probably would have went to a bowl game because they went 3-5 in the conference. But they went out and played Boise State, UCLA, Notre Dame, and took the Irish to the hilt. So, Dan, you got Virginia taking on Minnesota.
Shut my mic off there. Virginia is
for a few more. Yeah. Then you can shut it off.
Virginia is Exhibit A anytime a fan wants to complain about their home schedule. Because of that, when the schedule's released and you've got games against teams that maybe aren't competitive or are guaranteed wins and they're not marquee names, Virginia is Exhibit A as to why you shouldn't complain about that, because their non-conference schedule ruined their chance at going to a bowl game before the season ever started. Minnesota, in contrast, did play, I should say, TCU. I don't remember if that was neutral site or not, but I know they played them and they only lost by 6. They had a non-conference schedule that was manageable after that. Colorado State, Kent State, Ohio, knowing that their Big Ten schedule was going to be pretty hard. They managed to get into a bowl game despite falling apart down the stretch in a conference that is very hard. Virginia, a good team, didn't fall apart because they were never really put together. So I think this one goes to overtime because Minnesota gets to a bowl game because they're simply had a favorable schedule. Virginia didn't, but I'm taking Virginia because it's an ACC team, and I really want them to win one.
Okay. I would not be surprised if Virginia won this game. Minnesota, to their credit, look up the Michigan game. They were running the ball at the 1-yard line to beat Michigan. They played Ohio State relatively close. We're only down a touchdown with about 5 or 6 minutes left. And again, those are heavyweights. Those are like top 5 to 10 teams in the country. Minnesota also, they really played fairly well against decent teams. They only lost to TCU by 6 points. So it would not shock me if Virginia won this game. Minnesota's not bringing the running game this past year that they've had in the past, but I got to take Minnesota against, again, playing better against better teams. Aside from the Notre Dame effort, Virginia got blasted by Boise State, handled by UCLA, and then against the better teams within the ACC. All right. Ugly and uglier as we dip down to Syracuse and Illinois. Brittnee.
Yeah, this one, Syracuse was difficult to watch, I think, this year. As somebody who cheers for the ACC because I cover them, I really wanted them to pull it together a little bit more than they did. But when you're looking at Illinois, at least they were able to beat Nebraska. And if I'm going off that and going off how sloppy Syracuse got offensively there towards the end of the season, sorry, Syracuse fans, that gives me a little bit of an edge towards Illinois there.
All right, Dan, what do you like here with Illinois and Syracuse, or what don't you like? That's probably a longer list.
I apologize for nothing when I say that Syracuse was a god-awful team this year. Terrell Hunt got hurt 2 passes into the first game against Rhode Island, and it was over from there. They don't get me wrong, they won their first 3 games. They beat Wake Forest, they beat Central Michigan, and then at some point they had to start a walk-on quarterback. And I can tell you that when you have to start a walk-on freshman quarterback, that's not good. And so Syracuse fell apart. And then when they were done falling apart, they fell apart a little bit more. And then they played Boston College and won. So realistically, that I throw the last win out because honestly, a good high school team probably could have held Boston College to under 20 points. So I'm going with Illinois because I think Syracuse was absolutely just terrible. Illinois, not much better. They weren't very good, but they weren't as bad as Syracuse.
Yeah, so Illinois 5-7, Syracuse 4-8. They both got trampled for the most part in conference, but Illinois seemed to hang with the better teams. They gave Wisconsin a decent game, gave Iowa a decent game. They did get trampled by North Carolina. This is no endorsement for Illinois, but I'm going to take the Fighting Illini, now coached by Lovie Smith as of yesterday. All right, we're dipping down to Maryland and Georgia Tech, so we are completely out of bowl play here. We're talking pretty rough stuff here, Brittnee, with the Yellow Jackets and the Terps.
Yeah, when you look at this matchup, Maryland has a little bit of an edge offensively as far as production goes, and by the numbers, perhaps a little bit of an edge defensively. But what I foresee for this game is Georgia Tech pulling off some impossible last-second touchdown a la Florida State and giving the ACC fans the win they so desperately want at this point in the show. So, Georgia Tech.
Right, Dan, top that.
Are we talking about Maryland coached by Randy Edsall, or are we talking about Maryland after Randy Edsall? Because they went from bad to worse. I think Maryland was terrible this year, and the thing about Randy Edsall that I'll just throw in there is that I think he got the Maryland job because he took Connecticut to a Fiesta Bowl. People forget the only reason why they got that Fiesta Bowl because it was a who wants it less situation, and he capitalized on it with having a team in a strung out league that they managed to win the right amount of games over the right opponent and then get to a marquee bowl game where they were promptly throttled. So he took over a Maryland team after that, to be honest, he really wasn't, I don't think, cut out for. I still think Georgia Tech's got a better coach. I don't think Georgia Tech's as bad as the record. I really love the triple option offense. I've always been a fan of it. So I'm taking Georgia Tech. I don't even think this one's close.
Yeah, I didn't forget that scenario, Dan. The Big East had no business playing in BCS games any year, aside from a couple of West Virginia teams. Otherwise, that was a free pass and a bad situation. I like Georgia Tech to win that game as well. I don't think it's close. Maryland, awful. Rutgers, another gift to the Big. Well, that's the gift to the Big Ten from the ACC. Maryland football. Well, now we're in March. It's Maryland basketball, so there's a trade-off there. There's a bit of a balance. Now we get down to Wake taking it on Rutgers. Brittnee, what do you have there?
This is one of those ones that Dan talked about where we're picking by colors and logos and cute centers. By the way, I don't think I've ever seen a cute center, so I'm not really sure where you even came up with that.
Basketball. Basketball.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, this is one of those ones. Wake was just so awful this year. I mean, Rutgers not any better. But when you're breaking it all down, I do think the advantage that Rutgers might be being in a conference that arguably this year was a little bit better than the ACC. So if that gives them any kind of an advantage, I would take Rutgers just for getting to play some tougher teams than perhaps Wake Forest is getting to play.
Dan, both these teams went 1-7 in their respective conferences. You're very familiar with the Wake win, in which they scored the whopping total of 3 points. Rutgers beat Maryland. So they're Indiana or somebody. Go to it.
We have a common opponent, and we have a common denominator in this series. Wake Forest beat Army West Point by 3 points. Rutgers beat Army West Point by 10. However, Wake Forest shirts, their jersey shirts, remind me of Zubaz pants in the early 90s. I'm taking Wake Forest.
All right. Rutgers wins this game over. We have another common opponent. It would be Indiana. Rutgers slipped by Indiana. Indiana beat Wake. Okay, and finally, we're at the bottom of the barrel. Dan, take it away. I'll give you the one upsmanship over Brittnee for the final game here. The Toilet Bowl with Boston College taking on Purdue.
For all the tomorrow's going to mark on Thursday, March 10th, 2016 will officially be one calendar year since Boston College won an ACC game in football or basketball. They beat Georgia Tech in the ACC tournament in basketball. Since then, it has been 0-27, including their loss in basketball in the ACC tournament. So I'm taking Boston College. Why? Because defense. The defense was unbelievable this year, and like I've always said about the Boston College defense, and I really want to give people an appreciation for it, is that they were the #1 ranked defense in the nation, and they were doing it with an offense that was ranked pretty much dead last. You had to consider that defense, every single drive, went out and made a stop, and that defense, every single drive, made a stop against opponents that were getting the ball back almost immediately. So you're talking time of possession tilted against the Eagles. You're talking pretty much number of plays tilted against the Eagles, and the defense still went out and made stops. That's why I'm taking Boston College to beat Purdue. Now, that said, we're going to actually get the chance in a couple of years to see this great exhibition of American college football in a couple of years when they schedule the home and home against one another. But Boston College's defense was an X factor, and I think playing a last-place Purdue team, I think that makes the difference. And I'm going to take Boston College to win, even though my head dude, Don Brown, went up to the team up north and is now working for Harbaugh.
All right, Brittnee. Purdue was able to squeeze out a win in the Big Ten, unlike Boston College, who finished 0-8 in the ACC. That's my setup stat for you.
Well, and that's the stat that I looked at and helped me pick Purdue to be able to win this, was that at least they had that one win. And although Boston College's defense may have been able to keep the score of the game very low, I wasn't sure that their offense would be able to put anything on the scoreboard for them to actually win with. So unfortunately, sorry, Dan, I did take Purdue in this one.
Purdue beat Nebraska. They scored 55 points against Nebraska. I believe Nebraska had their third-string quarterback in the game. Purdue played Michigan State well. That said, I'm setting up for the Purdue win. No, I'm going to break the tie and give it to Dan. I do believe in the defense. I think Boston College defense is that good. Purdue basically had some decent quarterback play, a running back, and just, yeah, sieve on defense. I think Boston College would actually maybe break 20 points against Purdue and win a 20-17 type game against the Boilers. So we have a final score of the Big Ten at 24 and the ACC 18. That's the final score. 3 of us, 14 games, 42 games, 24-18 ACC. And coming up this year in 2016, we have 3 rematches from last season. Wake, Indiana, Duke, Northwestern, North Carolina, Illinois, all played in September, and 1 additional game. Nice little matchup with Penn State going to Pitt to renew a rivalry on September 10th. All right, Brittnee, Dan, thank you so much for sizing up the ACC against the Big Ten. This has been the ACC Breakdown, and we will see everyone next week.